Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. Keep up with the latest dinosaur discoveries and science with us. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today, in our 492nd episode, we have news about dinosaur brains and about early dinosaur evolution.
2 separate news items.
Yeah. And I also have some listener feedback. We're getting our first listener feedback in from our new form that anybody can fill out and give us feedback in.
Sounds like you went down an Eryctodromaeus burrow.
I sure did. There was a news item I was going to cover, but I got so deep into this, I instead just did really intense listener feedback. The original intention was to make the listener feedback quick answers, but I don't do anything quick. Everything is thorough. So they're going to be very thorough answers.
Well, we actually have 2 pieces of listener feedback. One of them was they sent us a news item, and one of them was what you answered.
Well, then we have 3 because I'm doing a question as well as a piece of more typical feedback.
Oh, wow.
And if you sent us feedback and it's not one of these things, it may come up in a future episode. And of course, we have a dinosaur of the day, and this week it's Dracovenator.
Not Dracovenator or Dracovenator.
I guess it could be any of those. I also have a fun fact. But before we get into all of that, I want to quickly thank some of our patrons. And of course, we have 10 wonderful patrons to thank. And they are Ayumi, Philip, Dang, Buffy, Chuck, Amatotitan, Eric, Ian, Elrex, and Histologysaurus.
Nice. I love hearing the shout-out names, but Histologysaurus, that's a cool one because obviously related to histology and slicing up those bones.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for being part of our community. We really appreciate it. And I know we say this a lot, but having you Dino-It-Alls is really what keeps our podcast going. We could not do it without you. So thank you. All right, moving on into the news about dinosaur brains. There are actually 2 items about dinosaur brains, but I'll start with the more general one, which is that brain size varied in dinosaurs.
Not surprising.
Maybe not, but apparently there in the past has been a catch-all value of 0.5. That's the ratio between the volume of the brain and the brain cavity. It's known as the brain to endocranial cavity, or BEC index.
Oh, so it's not just the size of the brain varied, but the proportion of the brain inside the skull varied.
Yes, depending on the type of dinosaur. This was published in the Journal of Comparative Neurology by Fabian Knoll and others, and it's open access. And the team looked at bird brains and crocodilian brains and measurements of brain casts or endocasts of dinosaurs. In birds, the brain fills nearly all of the space, but in crocodilians, it might only take up a small space of the cavity.
A lot of extra empty room in those skulls.
Yes. So endocasts are a proxy for brain size and shape because, well, we don't really have brains of non-avian dinosaurs.
Yeah. And the endocast is sort of just what gets filled in, the inside shape of the brain case.
Yes, it shows the size and the shape of the brain, but the brain and the cavity where the brain lies or where the brain was aren't the same because there's also nerves, blood vessels, fluid, and more. So that's how you get this BEC index. Again, the ratio between the volume of the brain and the brain cavity.
Yeah, even in our skulls, there's a little bit of a gap between the brain and the skull. And I know I've heard people talk about how our brain pulses a little bit with our heartbeat, and there has to be room for it to grow and shrink and stuff. Because if there isn't room, you end up with problems when it's pressed up too hard against the skull.
Mm-hmm. And it turns out that things get affected by, for example, doming. Like the more domed it is, the less volume of the non-brain portion of the cavity. So in other words, the more domed it is, the bigger the brain. And you have to take things like that into account. So this team developed an equation to fine-tune the BEC index. And that's how they figured out that dinosaur brains, well, depending on the type of dinosaur you were, you had different sized brains. Again, that catch-all value, as they put it, was 0.5, but they found that in ceratopsians and thyreophorans, so the horned dinosaurs and the ankylosaur and stegosaurs, it was 0.6.
And that's a larger number means a larger brain?
Yeah, the brain filled up more space.
Ah,
And then it was even bigger in ornithopods and pachycephalosaurs, sauropods, and theropods. Those were at 0.7.
that's kind of funny, though, because they're switching from one catch-all value of 0.5 to 3 catch-all values or 2 catch-all values, because I assume there's still a fair amount of variability between those individual dinosaurs.
Well, it's meant to be a foundation for further research, so it's a starting point to kind of refine things and get even more details.
I guess they had to point out that there was a difference somewhere before getting into what the specific animals might be. And I guess also it's really hard to do on a specific dinosaur level because, like you were saying, the brains don't even preserve. So figuring out what ratio of brain size based on the shape of the brain case is going to be really difficult.
Yes.
So they're just taking birds and crocodilians today, looking at the shape of their brain cases and how much the brain fills it up, assuming that dinosaurs had a similar limitation or set of factors that affected the size of their brain.
Yes.
And then came up with those numbers.
Yeah, you got to start somewhere. And birds and crocodilians are usually the best place to start for for the non-avian dinosaurs.
Pretty much the only place you can start since they're the only living things that are at all related or closely related.
But that brings me to our next story, and that's about how brain casts or endocasts can also tell us a lot about dinosaur behavior. So it turns out the dinosaur Thescelosaurus had a powerful sense of smell, a sensitive vestibular system, but terrible hearing, all of which may mean that it was a burrowing dinosaur.
Huh.
And we learned all that from the endocast. This was a study by David Button and Lindsay Zano in Scientific Reports, also open access.
Thescelosaurus. Digging.
Now, the vestibular system, Garrett, you and I know that because of toddlers and the importance of the vestibular system. Also, our older relatives are having trouble with vertigo recently because of issues with their vestibular system.
It does seem like everybody we know over a certain age is getting vertigo all of a sudden, and it is the vestibular system.
Yes.
The vestibular system, a lot of it is in the inner ear, so that sort of gives you balance. It's what malfunctions when you get seasick and what sort of rights the ship if you're walking quickly or turning your head and things. It needs to figure out which way is up and which way is down is maybe the most important thing that it does. But it also helps you just sort of generally figure out the position of your body.
Yes, so it's important. Now back to Thescelosaurus. Scientists made a 3D model of the inside of its brain. And Thescelosaurus is a Neornithischian. That's a group that wore their teeth down unevenly from chewing and then developed sharp ridges so they could break down tough plant food. The name Thescelosaurus means marvelous lizard or godlike or wondrous. It's really hyped up.
That's a very lofty name, yeah.
Yeah. It walked on 2 sturdy legs. It averaged about 2.5 to 4 meters or 8 to 13 feet long, and it weighed up to 340 kilograms, nearly 750 pounds. It also had small, wide hands and a long, pointed snout and powerful arms.
That's pretty marvelous.
Yeah. It was named in 1913, so kind of early days. It lived in a coastal plain environment, like swamps and marshes. Its full name is Thescelosaurus neglectus, and that species name neglectus is kind of fitting because for a long time, this dinosaur has been overlooked.
It's weird to say it's both wondrous and godlike and overlooked
Yes.
in one name.
Well, if it ever gets requested as a dinosaur of the day, we can get into that more. This new study, though, shows that Thescelosaurus had an incredible sense of smell. Its brain was average or below average for its body size, but its olfactory bulbs, which help with the sense of smell, make up about 3% of the endocast volume, which is larger than modern birds and similar to modern rabbits and pikas. So it used smell to help it find food, and smell would also help this dinosaur stay away from predators and identify its family and young underground.
Oh, I see. So it's that intense smelling ability that they think might mean it was underground.
Yes. That and other reasons like the powerful arms, which would mean it'd be able to dig holes. Its snout could root around in the dirt. There's no preserved burrows like with Eryctodromaeus, but the thinking is maybe it spent some time underground and some time above ground. And Thescelosaurus also had that relatively small brain, and again, the sensitive vestibular system, which probably would have helped it underground. It didn't have great hearing, but when you put all those things together, along with its great sense of smell, those are all good things for burrowing and good for survival. As for its hearing, the study found it probably couldn't tell the difference between low and high frequency sounds very well. Its hearing range was similar to some crocodilians and squamates, lizards and snakes, but not as good as other dinosaurs like Dinosaurus. It could probably hear best between about 1100 to 1200 hertz, with an upper limit of over 3050 hertz. For comparison, Dinosaurus is estimated to have a hearing range of about 350 to 3850 hertz. So it's a lot more of a narrow range.
It's on par with some of the other dinosaurs we've seen those calculations done on. Most dinosaurs couldn't hear particularly well, especially compared to how well we can hear, because we can hear up to about 20,000 hertz.
So yeah, even though we don't have the brains of non-avian dinosaurs, we can still learn a lot from those endocasts.
It's super helpful that they had these very interesting shaped brains. Their brains weren't just like small versions of our brains, which are fairly round, like looking at the skull of a human, you can't see that much detail about our brain shape. But dinosaurs had these big bumps sticking out in different places, and it reflects that, like you were saying, in the shape of the inside of the skull. So even without the brain, you can see these, like you were saying, the olfactory lobes are bigger on this one, or the optic lobe is bigger on that one. And you can tell then that this one probably spent more effort in smelling, and the other one might have spent more effort on seeing things.
Yeah, I think it's just another example of like multidisciplinary studies filling in these gaps and painting a picture of what non-avian dinosaurs were like.
It is really cool. I like you're saying, multidisciplinary, and also pulling in new things to try to get ideas about their behavior is when it's really satisfying. Because like you're saying, well, you could look at its body and say like, oh, it had strong arms. Maybe it could dig. But there's a lot of things that strong arms could be good for. But when you can pull in other aspects like its brain and the fact that it had a good sense of smell and maybe not as good of a sense of sight and hearing.
And a sensitive vestibular system.
Then I guess that means burrower.
All right, next up, this is our first piece of listener feedback. I want to thank Aaron who shared this news item with us through our new forum. That forum again is bit.ly/dinoquestions if you have any feedback you want to share with us or questions that you want to ask. There's a new hiking trail with 134 sauropod dinosaur footprints now open to the public in Colorado. This is according to the Denver Gazette. These tracks are 150 million years old. They're part of 27 acres of mining claim parcels that were acquired by 3 national forests. The track site's called the West Gold Hill Dinosaur Track Site. The property was owned by the Charles family since 1945, but the family didn't know that there were dinosaur tracks until 2021. These tracks were described as pothole-like features.
Sounds like sauropod tracks.
It does. But once the family realized their significance, they approached the Forest Service. The tracks are thought to be made by one dinosaur that looped a little. And in the future, there's going to be a website with more information and signs at the site. If you want to see it, you can take a 2-mile trail, the Silver Shield Trail. It's steep, though, with an elevation gain of 1,600 feet.
That does sound steep, because you said it's only 27 acres, and to go up 1,600 feet in anything that's 27 acres, that's some serious climbing.
But it's cool that anyone can go and visit these tracks.
Yeah, it's very nice, too, that the people that had it on their land reached out to somebody to preserve it.
And speaking of dinosaur sites, last bit of news is that the Gene and Rick Edelman Fossil Park is opening in June in New Jersey. And this park is 65 acres. There's going to be a 44,000 square foot museum above a former marl quarry. And the museum's going to have a Dryptosaurus replica on display. The Dryptosaurus was found a mile from the park back in 1866.
Nice.
And they're also going to have a 53-foot-long mosasaur, which I guess is pretty cool.
It's all right.
Yeah. It costs $73 million to make this park, yeah. And when it opens, you can go and dig for fossils and keep many as souvenirs, though some of them might have to stay behind for research if they're significant. More than 50,000 fossils have been found in the area so far, and they said they've barely scratched the surface.
I just checked. It's in Mantua Township, which is just southwest of Haddonfield, named after Hadrosaur. Actually, the other way around. Hadrosaurus.
But it's where Hattie is.
Yep, and it's really close to Philadelphia. I remember, too, when we went to see the original site where Hattie the Hadrosaurus was found, the original Hadrosaur. Super cool. And the only thing there is just a little sign that a Boy Scout put up, or at least a Boy Scout found the location of.
I think it's technically refound or relocated in the 1980s.
Because it was originally found when they found the dinosaurs?
Yeah, and then it was kind of off the radar for a while.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's just at the end of a dead-end street in a residential area, and there isn't really much to do there. And I guess you could go to Trenton, and you could see some dinosaur mounts there, or you could go to the Academy of Sciences in Philadelphia. But really close in New Jersey, there wasn't much in the way of exciting dinosaur stuff. So maybe this will fill that gap. And that's, I believe, a very important quarry. Maybe the one that Marsh and Cope were feuding about. If not that one, a similar quarry in New Jersey. I know it was a marl pit.
Some history there, maybe. In addition to the fossil history.
Yeah. And in just a moment, I'll get into our listener feedback, which includes a pretty ridiculous mistake I made, which I think was pretty funny. And also an update on Ornithoscelida. And now getting into our listener feedback segment. Very excited to start doing these. And again, if anybody has feedback, bit.ly/dino questions. So our first piece of feedback came from Travis, who said, in episode 490, during the section about Eotyrannus, Garrett had a hilarious slip of the tongue saying modern Tyrannosaurs when he meant later or latest Tyrannosaurus. It made me wonder what a modern Tyrannosaur with a further 66 million years of evolution might have looked like.
Would it be a farmer, a rancher, like in The Good Dinosaur?
Oh, yeah, because the sauropods were farmers and the Tyrannosaurs were ranchers.
Yeah.
I guess that's possible. I should say I did not notice that I misspoke there, and I also didn't notice when I was editing it.
Oops.
But I guess in my head, T-Rex is just the modern Tyrannosaur. Just feels modern to me for some reason.
Is it because the paleoart around it keeps changing?
That could be. I think it's also because it has so many advanced features that earlier Tyrannosaurs didn't have. Like it had the biggest serrated teeth. It had the biggest, baddest head. It had the biggest, most powerful legs.
2 fingers.
Yeah, the smallest arms, proportionally. It was also possibly social. It just seems so modern as far as Tyrannosaurs get, I guess. I don't know. But as to what a modern Tyrannosaur would look like, I don't think they would have become ranchers because in the 140 plus million years that dinosaurs were around, they didn't start ranching as far as we know. So I don't know why another 60 million years would have made a big difference. I also don't think they would have evolved into humanoids or dinosauroids, as has been occasionally proposed.
Maybe they could fly.
Maybe.
They would have had to shrink, though.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because even though we think of tyrannosaurs as a specific type of animal, there's no reason to really think that they would have stayed looking at all like that for 66 million years. There's a very good chance they would have changed to something either familiar to us now, looking a lot like something that's around today, or just changed to something completely novel. And it would be like, oh yeah, tyrannosaurs started out as these small predators like Guanlong, and then evolved into these huge apex predators, and then an offshoot of them became these small, silly things around today, kind of thing.
That occasionally bite you.
Maybe.
I could see if they were around today, they would be biters.
Okay. I've also seen people argue that the shoebill is the modern Tyrannosaur.
It does look very dinosaur-like, non-avian dinosaur-like.
Yes, it's pretty imposing. The scientific name of the shoebill is Balenoceps rex, which means it could be abbreviated B-rex.
B-rex is kind of taken.
I mean, it's taken by Balenoceps by phylogenetic nomenclature.
I was thinking about the nickname, though. B-rex for a T-rex with medullary bone.
That's true.
Anyway.
So I guess there is a B-rex that is modern and a B-rex T-rex. The shoebill is also known as the whale-headed stork. Their bill is enormous. It's kind of like a wide pelican beak, but it's also got an intimidating point sticking down from the tip of the bill, not unlike a terror bird. And they can grow to about 140 centimeters or almost 5 feet tall, meaning they could practically look Sabrina right in the face.
Don't like that.
That would be really unpleasant.
Good thing I'm a little taller than that.
But its eyes are on the top of its head, so it might be eye to eye with you. Well, I guess they could also fly, so in that way, they could definitely be above anybody. As usual for a bird, though, they're ridiculously light for their size. They only weigh about 4 to 7 kilograms or 9 to 15 pounds.
Is that like similar to a cat?
Yeah, pretty much. But, dinosaurs always punch way above their weight. I don't think T-Rex would have evolved into B-Rex given another 66 million years.
Didn't need to. There's already a B-Rex.
But, I mean, this B-Rex...
I know.
The reason I don't think it necessarily would have shrunk down and turned into a shoebill is that we had a lot of really large carnivorous dinosaurs throughout the Mesozoic, and most of them stayed pretty big. They didn't all stay multiple tons like T-Rex, but most of these dinosaur groups stayed, in the hundreds of kilograms sort of range once they got big. So if Tyrannosaurus survived to today, I think there's a decent chance that they would have stayed pretty big. I also think there's a high probability they would have struggled with the changes in the climate, even if they didn't have to deal with the Chicxulub impact, especially with the various ice ages that have happened.
Mm-hmm.
My guess is that during an ice age, there'd be a selection bias for tyrannosaurs with lots of feathers. Thinking of Eutyrannus.
Oh, yeah. Good point.
Feathers also have an advantage over a thick coat of fur in that even though the animals that had thick fur were doing well when it was cold out, when it got a lot warmer, they struggled. Whereas with a thick coat of feathers, it's a little bit easier to deal with when it gets warm out because they can sort of fluff the feathers. We've talked about before how feathers are just better than hair in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Even penguins can do okay in the heat sometimes, and they're very adapted for the cold. So maybe they would have survived better after the Ice Age than some of the woolly animals would have. So today, maybe we'd have something like Eutyrannus if the Tyrannosaur lineage managed to keep going for so long. That's my best guess.
I would love to see other people's ideas of what a modern Tyrannosaur looks like.
Yeah. There's also a very good chance, like you were saying, that it would have just turned into something completely different because 66 million years is a really long time. There's a good chance that if theropods, the non-avian theropods, especially the big carnivores, didn't go extinct, there'd be something kind of like a tyrannosaur. But there's also a good chance that the specific group of tyrannosaurs would have just gone off a totally different way or gone extinct or whatever. And some other group would have grown to be really big, like how you had the big allosaurids, like Giganotosaurus, that were dominant before you had T-Rex. So thank you to Travis for that correction and fun
thought experiment.
Yeah. Then our next piece of feedback comes from Ryan the biochemist, who asked, I find the Ornithoscelida hypothesis fascinating. Where does the debate currently stand? And could you explain what anatomical features support Ornithoscelida versus the traditional model? I have to say I completely agree with Ryan that the Ornithoscelida hypothesis is fascinating.
Yes.
We actually interviewed Matt Barron, who was the lead author on that paper quite a while ago. It was actually way back in episode 145.
Ooh, that was a long time ago.
But if you want to hear right from the source what Ornithoscelida is all about and where the research started from, listen to that episode. But I'll give a quick overview for those who don't know what we're talking about. And before I do, I need to do a quick overview of dinosaurs in general.
You got to do an overview for the overview?
I do, because taxonomic stuff and nomenclature and phylogenetics are so full of jargon that you really have to go back to the beginning so that it all makes sense. So dinosaurs are split into 3 major groups, not just 2, I would say. The 3 groups are Ornithischia, Sauropodomorpha, and Theropoda. Sauropoda was named by O.C. Marsh in 1878, and it means lizard foot. Later, it got expanded to Sauropodomorpha to include other earlier relatives.
Makes sense. Those big old lizard foot havers that make pothole-looking footprints.
Yep, those are the ones. But I guess the Sauropodomorphs, some of them had smaller feet. The theropods were named by O.C. Marsh back in 1881, and it means beast foot.
2 of the groups that Marsh named are still, everybody knows sauropods, everybody knows theropods, so maybe by that token alone, Marsh won the Bone Wars.
Yes, I mean, he won by a lot of tokens, but those are 2 incredibly influential names in Dinosauria, for sure. And then Ornithischia was named by Harry Seeley in 1888. If you're not familiar, Theropoda includes mostly bipedal predators like T-Rex, but it also includes things like Gallimimus and Therizinosaurs, and also every flying dinosaur, including modern birds.
Like the shoebill.
Yep, that is in fact a theropod. Sauropodomorpha includes the long-necked dinosaurs like Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus, as well as early stuff like Plateosaurus. And even earlier stuff as well. Ornithischia includes most of the herbivores, things like stegosaurs, triceratops, ankylosaurs, pachycephalosaurs, a lot of the interesting herbivores. Basically all the herbivores other than Sauropodomorpha and just a few theropods are in Ornithischia. I will say you can't go wrong with Ornithischia, Sauropodomorpha, and Theropoda. If you're ever going for a broad classification of a dinosaur, if you use one of those, you'll always be okay. You don't ever have to worry about Ornithoscelida or Saurischia. It'll work fine. The tricky part with dinosaurs and those 3 groups is how they get combined. Since we have 3 major groups, it can be tempting to select 2 of them as a subgroup. And if you remember combinatorics, if you have 3 things and you're picking 2 of them, there are 3 ways to do that. You can have A and B, A and C, or B and C. So Harry Seeley took the first shot at combining 2 of them back in 1888 at the same time when he named Ornithischia. What he did was he noticed that there were 2 main categories of hips in dinosaurs. There were those that had a pubis pointing backwards, like in birds. Those are the Ornithischians, or the bird-hipped dinosaurs. And then there were those that have the pubis pointing forwards, like in lizards, and he named those Saurischia for lizard hips. But Saurischia, when he defined them, is just Theropoda plus Sauropodomorpha. I'm ignoring Herrerasaurids and some other early stuff for simplicity. So Saurischia is literally just theropods and sauropodomorphs most of the time.
I think we still see those classifications in a lot of museums.
Yeah, Saurischia is the most commonly used group of 2 of those 3 main groups for sure. But mostly when people are studying dinosaurs, you don't see Saurischia mentioned that much. It's more common that people will talk specifically about theropods or sauropodomorphs because there isn't a whole lot of value in talking about Saurischia unless you're talking about the really early stuff and hypotheses about how those groups evolved. You're usually better off just sticking to the 3 main groups. Ironically, though, we now know that birds evolved from theropods, which are lumped in with the saurischian or lizard-hipped dinosaurs, and not the bird-hipped dinosaurs.
Silly birds.
So birds are lizard-hipped, according to this, and the bird-hipped things aren't birds. It's weird. Interestingly, there are many examples of the hip switching orientation within the groups. It's not just birds that flipped around. There are other large herbivores that changed the style of their hips, and other examples of hips just evolving. I mean, they're around for over 100 million years. Lots of interesting things happen with the hips. So Saurischia is definitely the most common combination of two of the groups, being sauropodomorphs and theropods. But there are two other options. It also wouldn't be surprising if Saurischia wasn't the right answer, because it was named in 1888 when we only had found maybe 5% of the dinosaurs that we know of now. Maybe 10%, depending on how generous you're being with valid taxon.
Hard to classify on a small sample.
Yeah, exactly. There were tons of groups we did not even know about when Saurischia was named. And given that the groups were named well over 100 years ago, it is worth taking a look at those groups periodically to see if Saurischia is the best category, if you want to lump two of them together. And people have been doing that over the years. Right around the 100-year anniversary of Saurischia, Bob Bacher's 1986 book, The Dinosaur Heresies, came out.
Oh yeah, that was a big one.
Yeah, the book is fantastic. It is famous for arguing that dinosaurs were warm-blooded.
And active, and isn't it every dinosaur illustrated is, what was it, on up in the air or on its some kind
on
of
like
movement?
one leg.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Dancing.
Yeah, they're all moving all over the place. It's got excellent drawings. It covers a lot of ground. But when I read it, I think the thing I was most surprised by was that it proposed a new way to group dinosaurs. In the Dinosaur Heresies, Bacher proposes the name Phytodinosauria, meaning plant dinosaurs. And in that grouping, it's a combination of sauropods and ornithischians. So with that grouping, you've got the Phytodinosauria, and then you have theropods left alone, basically in the remnants of Saurischia after the sauropodomorphs left them. He wasn't the only one to propose that. Actually, a year earlier in 1985, Cooper defined a group he called Ornithoscelida, which is basically identical to Phytodinosauria, and I guess would probably be the preferred term if either of these caught on, but they didn't really. So Phytodinosauria / Ornithoscelida
really rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, I like Phytodinosauria a lot better. It's also nice that it means plant dinosaurs and they're all plant eaters. And that's basically how they were defined, by their teeth having leaf-shaped teeth with serrations useful for eating plants. You see those both in sauropods and ornithischians. Not surprising, because they all ate similar food. But now we think that the teeth evolved separately in different groups rather than being from a common ancestor of all herbivorous dinosaurs. So that's why you don't hear the word Phytodinosauria much. Oftentimes, these new groupings come up when we find new early dinosaurs, because the fossil record is still very patchy. So just one new dinosaur from the right time with the right features can help fill in a lot of details and kick off some brainstorming about how the different dinosaurs might be related. It's especially true when you get something from the late Triassic, or if you get an ornithischian from the early Jurassic, which is the earliest ornithischians that we have. For Bacher, the dinosaurs that sort of got the wheels in motion was Ankylosaurus, a sauropodomorph, as well as Lasutosaurus, an ornithischian, both very early. But more recently, we've got things like Eoraptor, a sauropodomorph, and Lachintosaura, which is an ornithischian. And in 2017, Matt Barron and others wrote a paper with a totally different grouping than Saurischia or Phytodinosauria.
Yep, it's the Ornithoscelida.
Yep, exactly. That's Ornithoscelida. And if you're keeping track of which ones haven't been grouped together yet, it's theropods and ornithischians. Those hadn't been grouped previously. Technically, they were grouped previously by Thomas Henry Huxley, a friend of Charles Darwin's, back in 1869, and they revived the name.
So it's not that new, I guess.
No. And I mean, in 1869, that predates the names of the other groups. He had just grouped together some of the dinosaurs, which would be known from those groups in the future. The big advantage of Ornithoscelida is that it explains where ornithischians come from. In the traditional grouping, we have the saurischians going back to about 230 to 240 million years ago, especially with those sauropodomorphs. But the first ornithischians don't show up until about 200 million years ago. So that means there's about 30 to 40 million years without any ornithischians, which is really weird. But then with the Ornithoscelida hypothesis, ornithischians just evolved from theropods, basically. And so that fills in where they were in the late Triassic. They were just theropods. Ornithoscelida literally means bird legs. So that I'm finally answering one of the questions, the listener feedback. So both theropods and ornithischians have pretty bird-like legs, and that's where bird legs comes from. And Barron and his co-authors liked that name. So that's why they brought it back. You might think ornithischians don't have all that bird-like of legs if you're looking at something like a ceratopsian. But if you compare them to sauropods,
Those columnar legs.
they are much more bird-like. Yes. They also have another trait in common, which is feathers or protofeathers. You see them across ornithischians as well as theropods because we don't have any sauropod fossils with feathers.
Oh, that would be so cool.
It would be really cool. I think beaks are another thing that they have in common. You get those in ornithischians as well as theropods, but not sauropods as far as we know.
I thought sauropods could get a little beaky.
Maybe a little beaky.
There was a study a few years ago about like Camarasaurus possibly having something like a beak or, some kind of keratinous sheath.
But that's all hypothetical, not something that's actually been found yet.
It was based on fossils and a detailed analysis.
I think I remember that, but it was just based on the bones, and they were saying, like, maybe there was a beak here.
Yeah. So don't rule it out.
Okay. It would be cool. There's an interesting side note to Ornithoscelida, and it's that technically speaking, dinosaurs are usually defined as the most recent common ancestor of Triceratops and modern birds. And if you use that definition, you've got a theropod and an ornithischian there. So if dinosaurs are just the most recent thing you get between theropods and ornithischians, that makes Ornithoscelida dinosaurs as synonyms, which would mean that sauropods are no longer dinosaurs.
Oh, yeah. I remember not liking that about this framework.
Yeah. But really, the way that they picked Triceratops and modern birds was because you've got this old Saurischia, Ornithischia, and they picked those so that it would include all three groups. So what Barron and his co-authors did is they just added the third group. They just said, okay, rather than it just being Triceratops, modern birds, we're going to throw in Diplodocus. Yeah. And that way, no matter what, they're not getting kicked out of Dinosauria.
You can't kick out the best dinosaurs.
The biggest ones.
Biggest and best.
According to some people.
I'm not alone. I know this.
That's true. But overall, there isn't a lot of support for Ornithoscelida. Like most modern analyses, it's unsatisfying, but the way to get to the bottom of whether Ornithoscelida or Saurischia or Phytodinosauria are valid, or if none of them are valid, you basically rely on computers analyzing statistically what the most likely combination of dinosaurs into different groups would be. And recent papers have basically found that it could be any of them. There's just too much variability in those early dinosaurs and not enough information about them to really nail down which groups came from which in those early days, which is what you need in order to define if it's Ornithoscelida or Saurischia or Phytodinosauria. One last note on this topic. A couple of recent papers, including one by the two lead authors on the Ornithoscelida paper, basically put Silosaurs as the earliest ornithischians.
So Ornithoscelida is no more?
That's how we presented it at the time, although now I feel like we shouldn't have presented it like that at the time, because Silosaurs being ornithischians doesn't stop ornithischians from getting lumped together with any of the other groups. You could, any of these combinations are possible. But in their main phylogenetic tree, it did come out with the traditional Saurischia of sauropods and theropods together, not Ornithoscelida. The nice thing about it is that Silosaurs also solve the problem that Ornithischians solve of that weird gap in the Triassic where there aren't any Ornithischians, but rather than Ornithischians evolving from theropods within Ornithoscelida, you just have Silosaurs being the earliest Ornithischians. So we really don't know yet. We need more fossils. Maybe we'll never know. I don't know. I think it is also on the table that Saurischia goes away and everybody just uses theropod, sauropod, and Ornithischian because that's easy.
And all of those names are fairly familiar names, so easier to keep track.
Yeah, I never really liked Saurischia. It just seems needlessly broad. But maybe that's just me because I'm an Ornithischian kind of guy.
Could be. We'll get into our dinosaur of the day in just a moment, but first we're going to take a break for our sponsors. And now onto our dinosaur of the day, Dracovenator, or Dracovenator, depending on your preference for that last part. This was a request from Morgan via our Patreon and Discord, so thanks. It was a Neotheropod that lived in the early Jurassic in what is now South Africa, found in the Elliot Formation. And it was a medium-sized dinosaur, estimated to be up to 18 to 21 feet, or 5.5 to 6.5 meters long, and weighing 550 pounds, or 250 kilograms. Before Dracovenator was described, scientists knew from footprints that there were theropods found in its biozone, the area where it was found. It's possible that Dracovenator made the large theropod tracks that have been found. Although, as we know, it's really hard to tell what made a track.
Yes.
Unless that animal died right next to the track, and it's very clear that that's its footprint.
Its foot is stuck in the track.
Yeah.
Would be another way, I guess.
Then it's hard to know for sure. Dracovenator looked similar to Dilophosaurus. It walked on two legs and it had a long tail. But it's different from Dilophosaurus based on details in the jaws and teeth. Its skull is estimated to be about 50 centimeters or nearly 20 inches long. Paleoart shows it having two crests on the top of its head, but those bones haven't been found. But skull bones that have been found are similar to Dilophosaurus, so that's why the art shows the crests.
So if you're imagining Dracovenator, think about Dilophosaurus.
Yes.
You're most of the way there.
Yes. It also had lumps and bumps on its lower jaw, like Dilophosaurus, but smaller. It had long, slender lower jaws that gently curved and serrated teeth. And it had a narrow snout that tapered toward the tip, as well as a kink in its upper jaws.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the key features of Dilophosaurus is there's like that little gap of tooth near the tip.
Mm. For Dracovenator, its small snout is similar to Coelophysis rhodesiensis, aka Megapnosaurus rhodesiensis, but it had more compressed, blade-shaped, serrated teeth in the premaxilla, the very front of the jaw. The type species is Dracovenator regenti. The holotype is just a partial skull. The fossils were found by James Kitching and Regent Lucas Huma.
So that's why you have the species name Regenti after the regent?
Yes. It's in honor of the, quote, late Regent Lucas Huma, Professor Kitching's long-term field assistant and friend, end quote. The fossils were found in sandstone. The genus name means dragon hunter. It refers to the dinosaur probably preying on prosauropods and being found in the foothills of the Drakensberg range. So maybe it's Dracovenator. My Dutch is not great. That means dragon's mountain in Dutch.
I guess it depends how faithful to the Dutch you want to be in your pronunciation, too.
Right. And I do not know Dutch, so I could be way off there.
We're just going with usually that root word for dragon. It goes with Draco in English.
Mm. So Dracovenator was named by Adam Yates in 2005. There was a second specimen originally thought to be Syntarsis rhodesiensis that was found in 1981. It was a well-preserved snout. Yates found the snout that was referred to Syntarsis, though, might be a juvenile specimen of Dracovenator. And we talked about Syntarsis in episode 456. Now, Megapnosaurus, also in the past, sometimes Coelophysis. It's a long story, so I recommend you go back to that dinosaur of the day if you want to hear the whole story. As a quick review, though, Megapnosaurus looked a lot like Coelophysis. It had a long tail, it walked on 2 legs, it had short arms and a long face. Anyway, the jaws of the snout were clamped shut. They got so compressed, the scientists that studied it in 1999 said that it wasn't worth attempting to separate the jaws. They also thought the specimen got so crushed that all the details in the jaws might have been lost anyway. Yates said Dracovenator had a, quote, mosaic of coelophysoid and advanced theropod characteristics, end quote. Dracovenator probably lived on a floodplain, and other dinosaurs that lived around the same time and place include a lot of sauropodomorphs, like Massospondylus, Ornithoscelida, which now you know exactly what that is, thanks to your explanation, Garrett. They include things like Lasutosaurus and the coelophysid Megapnosaurus. Other animals that lived around the same time and place include crocodilomorphs and cynodonts.
Well, I guess it's a good thing that they had multiple specimens of Dracovenator because that one sounded pretty hard to deal with the jaws all smashed together.
Yeah, so again, the holotype is a partial skull that was found in sandstone. And then there's a second specimen, the well-preserved snout, that was originally thought to be Syntarsis.
Throw that baby in a CT scanner. See just how smashed up and ruined it really is. And our fun fact of the day is that according to the dinosaur heresies, pterosaurs are dinosaurs.
What?
One of the many controversial, one might say, heresies written in the dinosaur heresies. So in phylogenetic terms, the scientific definition of dinosaurs as a group, Dinosauria is usually defined as the most recent common ancestor of Triceratops and modern birds. And then again, Matt Barron picked the house sparrow as the modern bird. But any modern bird would work since their common ancestor is deep within Theropoda.
Yeah,
so
back to that shoebill.
Yeah, exactly. You could make it B-Rex. That could be your bird of choice for the definition of Dinosauria, if you want. In traditional taxonomic groups, combining just Triceratops and a sparrow get you everything we call a dinosaur, and that's because you have to trace back up the family tree until you get to a point where they split, meaning Triceratops and the sparrow's common ancestor, you can imagine, is pretty far back in time. So if you go from the house sparrow back up the dinosaur family tree, you go through the passerines first, the perching birds. That gets you back maybe about 50 million years ago. Then you go through all the birds, the AVs or the avialans, and then you get through all the theropods, and then finally you get to the saurischians if you want to do the saurischians. Otherwise, you just stop at the theropods. Either of those get you back to the Triassic. With the Triceratops family tree, you go up through all the ceratopsians, then you go through the marginocephalians, which is basically ceratopsians plus pachycephalosaurs, and then you get all of the ornithoscians. So when you combine those two, you get all the saurischians and all the ornithoscians, and therefore all the dinosaurs. Bob Bakker took a different approach in dinosaur heresies.
He took a lot of different approaches.
He did. He basically defined dinosaurs as all the descendants of Lagosuchus, or the group Lagosuchidae. Because Lagosuchus is farther up the family tree, that meant that pterosaurs got included. Although nowadays, Lagosuchus is generally considered to be a dinosaur morph, which means it's just outside of the true dinosaurs, but not quite an ancestor to pterosaurs. So even if that definition had been widely accepted, it probably would have still eliminated pterosaurs. Although elsewhere in the book, he basically includes pterosaurs by definition with dinosaurs. So if you did it that way, then they would still be included.
They did have a lot of similarities.
Yes, and we also have an equivalent term for what Bakker is calling quote-unquote dinosaurs, which to us means pterosaurs plus dinosaurs, or pterosaurs plus ornithoscians, theropods, and sauropods.
Or at least what Bakker meant.
Yeah, we have a new term for what Bakker was calling those dinosaurs. Now we call that group Avimetatarsalia, also known as Ornithodira. And that's because pterosaurs and dinosaurs are thought of as sister taxa, basically, or I guess technically dinosauromorphs and pterosauromorphs are considered sister taxa. So they are very close relatives, and it's sort of arbitrary whether or not what you include into dinosaurs. So we should be nice to people that mistakenly say pterosaurs are dinosaurs, because they are very close.
I don't think we've ever been mean to anyone who...
No, I know. I'm just saying in general, we, not us specifically. The dinosaur community. Much closer than something like mosasaurs. You can be a little harsh with mosasaurs. They're way out there.
More closely related to snakes.
Yep. But even though Bakker did say that pterosaurs were dinosaurs, we do have to thank Bob Bakker and Peter Galton for keeping the word dinosaur as a valid scientific term.
I didn't know that was up for debate.
It was. So in the 1970s, there was a hypothesis that dinosaurs weren't a single group, but actually different groups that had been lumped together incorrectly. The logic actually makes a lot of sense. So if saurischians are named after their reptile-like hips and they descended from reptiles, why would they get combined with ornithischians while other early reptiles aren't? So basically, if saurischians are just reptile-like, and there's lots of other reptile-like stuff going on in the Triassic, why are we picking out the reptile-like saurischians and calling them dinosaurs? The ornithischians are clearly something new and different based on their hips, but if the saurischians just have lizard hips, it doesn't seem that special. Why would they be combined? But fortunately, Bakker and Galton noticed similarities between the three major groups of dinosaurs, and also just generally saurischians and ornithischians, and successfully argued that dinosaurs are monophyletic and that the name was valid. This was very quickly backed up by other scientists and more discoveries. There were other people noticing the same thing, basically, and new dinosaurs helped. And it was also backed up by the rediscovered notes from the 1800s by Thomas Henry Huxley, who noticed some of the same similarities that Bakker and Galton noticed. Thomas Henry Huxley was really ahead of his time.
Yeah, he noticed the connection between non-avian dinosaurs and birds.
Yeah, which is another thing in the dinosaur heresies.
Was Huxley the original dinosaur heretic?
I think so. He was also arguing for evolution when it wasn't widely accepted and probably called a heretic, just generally speaking. I just think it's interesting that Bakker both lumped in pterosaurs with dinosaurs and also brought back dinosaurs as a name when they were losing favor.
Well, good job, Bob Bakker and Peter Galton. I don't know where we'd be if the word dinosaur wasn't being used.
Yeah. We'd have a different name for our podcast, that's for sure. It'd have to be I Know, Ornithisco, or Sauropod, but we like different ones, so what would we even do?
I don't know. It'd be confusing. I want to thank everyone again who has sent us questions and feedback so far. And also, a few episodes back, we mentioned that we love more reviews, and I want to thank LA1MSA, who left us a very nice review on Apple Podcasts. I don't want to toot our horn too much, so I'll just give you the headline, which says, "This show gives you the scientific reports." But yes, thank you so much for leaving such a nice review. And if you like listening to I Know Dino, we'd also really appreciate it if you told a friend. Sharing is caring, and it helps the show grow and keep going. Thanks again, and until next time.
Good day.